anniversary, as Eugen said, of Global Constitutionalism, and we're really excited to see the journal hit this milestone. The journal was originally set up by Antje Wiener and James Tully, and it was always intended to be an interdisciplinary journal. And one of the features that Antje kind of developed very early on was the idea of the annual editorial. So this is basically the editors of the journal at the time write a reflection, kind of a short reflection, maybe 5 to 10 pages of some kind of theme or topic in the world of global politics and law, and kind of reflect on what that means for the study of global constitutionalism in general. So I was actually going through them today. They're actually all up on our website. So if you click on our special collections section, they're always open access. So all 10 of them are up there. And they actually make a pretty interesting historical archive now. You can kind of see the shifting changes and concerns of the editor over time. And I actually think it's a good way to track recent global political history and recent kind of questions around international law too. One of the things that jumped out to me is 3 of our 5 previous editorials are explicit responses to Trump or right-wing populism. So starting with our editorial in 2017, which is no surprise, we had a piece kind of meditating on whether or not the twin, I guess, geopolitical shocks of Trump's victory and the Brexit vote in 2016 meant some sort of decline for the West and what that might mean for global political order. And then we've had 2 others since. So, now that we're kind of past Trump, and in some senses he's kind of faded from the background, but certainly, there's all that line about in DC politics about the power of the presidency seeps away very quickly. In one sense, he's kind of gone off to Mar-a-Lago and been essentially muted in some senses. It does seem that in other ways, there's kind of this looming question of whether or not Trump would win again if he decided to run in 2024. He's currently the leading candidate in the Republican primary, according to pollsters. So he certainly would have a possibility of doing that. Should he kind of opt to kind of continue to run? And there certainly is a sign that even though the Republican Party lost the election, which is actually quite rare for an incumbent in the U.S. system, it seems like the Republican Party is not really veering away from Trumpism. If the kind of strongest sign of that politically is kind of recently the stripping of Liz Cheney's House leadership position, right? And it's kind of quite a shock that the daughter of the former vice president, certainly an extremely conservative politician, is not conservative, or at least not Trumpist enough, if you will. So there seems to be, it's like Trump's effectively taken over the Republican Party. So that does, leave a couple of questions open that I want to kind of throw out here today. I don't have kind of definitive answers. They're more kind of just things that I puzzle over. So one is the ways in which U.S. domestic politics shapes geopolitics and international law, right? And one possible near-term future could be you see a cycling between a Republican Party that, when it holds power, does everything it can to break up the post-World War II consensus and kind of, leave things, international institutions such as the Paris Accords or the Iran nuclear deal, and kind of, sabotage or very least disrupt other international institutions such as NATO and the UN, and essentially be very much hostile to these kind of international institutions that very much kind of fit together in what we like to think of as being the global constitution. And then when the Democrats are in power, they essentially try to repair and put these pieces back together. So if you look at that kind of cycling, if you will, the geopolitical level, it kind of leads to a very destabilized system. And how do other states respond? How does the international legal community respond if one of its largest actors is sometimes trying to support building up this system and other times breaking away? It makes it very difficult to kind of have confidence or faith in treaties, or to kind of essentially make any kind of deal with a state that may kind of revoke its deals kind of at the next election. I think the second one, this is kind of in our second editorial on Trump. We broached this idea of what's called a breaching experiment in sociology and anthropology. And this idea comes from Harold Garfinkel, the American sociologist, who's very interested in the idea of social norms and kind of in interpersonal interactions. And so proposed the idea that the best way to test if a norm for what an appropriate behavior exists is to go out and break those norms and see how other people react to it. So one way of reading Trumpism is that he was someone who was basically kind of reveled in breaking all kinds of norms, right? Kind of just everything from refusing to attend the inauguration of a successor to violating very basic international protocols, or or kind of tearing up every single law or protocol on the way to conceding defeat in an election. And one of the points we made in that editorial is there's one school of thought that the constant breaching of norms might be a sign of their weakness, but we also suggested that actually it might be a sign of their robustness, right? The fact that everyone was outraged, there was a lot of pushback, that people had to spend a lot of time thinking about what those norms are and perhaps articulate them to kind of make clear why we don't do these things, or why it is necessary that the loser in an election does concede defeat. A lot of times these are kind of unarticulated, unreflected upon, but when someone breaks, you don't even have to think of it at the kind of level of geopolitics, just think of it at the level of, like, if you have a child who perhaps yet doesn't quite know all the appropriate norms of human behavior, if they do something that's wrong, you have to kind of set them aside and explain, no, this is why we do it, and it's only by them breaking the rule that you can point out to them that this is the rule that we comport by. So there is a way in which, the more optimistic or robust reading of Trumpism is that in breaking a lot of norms, he actually provoked the international community to kind of reinvest in those norms and lean back into them, and also kind of prompted other political actors to invest more capital in kind of strengthening the regimes that he was challenging or undermining. So that's potentially the more kind of optimistic account. So on the one hand, kind of the looming threat of Trumpism, or kind of a Trumpist kind of capturing the White House in the near-term future, means that perhaps Trump's a canary in the coal mine for a greater destabilization of the global constitutional order. But the other possible read is that this was a moment that kind of led to a reinvigoration of this normative order. So I'll turn over to Jacob now.
Thanks, Jonathan. I think that was great. Looking at the legacy of Trumpism, and it's obviously possible to link this to some of the other right-wing populist events that have occurred at the same time. For those of us in the UK, that's most obviously Brexit. But I think it's important to remember that Trump's election can be conceived of part of a wave of right-wing elections that occurred at the same time, particularly in Eastern Europe, and we that are challenged the seeming march of liberal democracy. The greatest challenge to me seems to be to a basic principle. That's one of the three pillars of global constitutionalism. The three stripes that are on the cover of the journal stand for democracy, human rights, and rule of law. And Trump was selected through a democratic process. Ironically enough, he rejected that very democratic process, as Jonathan noted, when he lost the subsequent election, but it was robust enough to eject him from office. But it raises, I think, a fundamental question about the degree to which we will trust democracy going forward. So insofar as there is a breaching experiment, it's not merely a breaching experiment regarding Trump's own conduct, but a breaching experiment regarding the selection of leaders and the competence and validity of democratic processes, and the degree to which we continue to trust liberal democracy going forward. I think one of the remarkable effects, and perhaps as academics this is particularly salient to us, one of the remarkable effects of Trump's election and parallel events has been to raise a degree of skepticism regarding the competence and sort of foundational validity of popular self-rule. Right? There's been a real sort of flood of concerns that a democratic decision would itself lead to the end of democracy's legitimacy. And Trump's defeat, I think, has not solved with an A as opposed to an O, sort of solved or softened some of those concerns. But I think it will be a real question going forward, the degree to which the basic principle of liberal democracy, the idea of the self-determination of the electorate, the self-determination of the polity itself, which has been a long-fought value of liberal democracy, and in my view, one of the great triumphs of human history. How that will respond and the degree to which it will survive the difficulties of 2016, 2015, and 2016. And one of the reasons I'm glad this is a discussion instead of a presentation is I'm still wrestling with this myself. Jonathan mentioned that Trump is currently the leading candidate for the Republican Party for the 2024 election. Still very early days, and to a non-trivial degree, I think social science tells us that probably just reflects his name recognition. But were he to be elected again in 2024, to what degree would this suggest a broader erosion of the norms of self-determination, the ideal that self-determination is the fundamentally legitimate way for a polity to rule itself? I think it's critical that we don't abandon how central that has been to the liberal democratic project. And that I find some of the skepticism that emerged, not so much through GlobCon, but more broadly in the scholarship, some of the skepticism regarding the competence and core of the rule of a polity through the will of the people as being central. But I do think that Trump raises a basic question about competence. And that's where I see the real concerns being raised. That's my main thought. I'm happy to turn it over to Jo if she wants to speak now, though I know she will be speaking at the end as well, but maybe she just has a few comments as the discussion gets started.
No, I don't think so. I'll save my remarks for later on, because I was going to talk a little bit about how this might also frame the way some of the questions that the journal really wants to focus on in the coming years. So I think I'll leave that until the end. Hopefully some of those things will come up in questions and discussion as well. So
should we I think we can open the discussion.
Yeah, please do. Hopefully some of our audience will want to or co-interlocutors will want to discuss with us some of the issues that we've raised, and perhaps some of the questions that they've identified in global constitutionalism that they would like to see being treated in more detail in the future. And we can always see how we might be able to nudge the debate in that direction.
Yes, indeed. And, thank you for all these remarks. So as you know, we can talk about this GlobCon after Trump for hours, but we have only 1 hour and now, so we can open the discussion. So please do feel free to add your questions, raise your hands, please. It would be great to have your contributions here. So I think, Lucretia, please do join.
Yes. Hi, I don't so much have comments so far, as I wanted to just maybe problematize a couple of the assumptions that were part of the comments that were already made in relation to Jonathan's remarks. I was wondering if it really is the case that we see that back and forth between Democrats and Republicans when it comes to U.S. commitment to global governance and international institutions and international law, or if there is more of a more stable pattern of very selective support for international law and international institutions that permeates both Democratic and Republican administrations. Without any question, President Trump just took things to a different level. But I wonder if that is more rhetorical than in the actual level of support. because I feel like both across Democratic and Republican administrations, we see a lot of leadership in the creation of international law, big involvement at the negotiation stage, but then when it comes to actually committing, the US just looks the other way, or just ratifies but with tons of reservations and things like that. So I just wanted to problematize the assumption that we do see this back and forth between Republicans and Democrats, and that makes it difficult for partners to trust the US. I don't think it's so much Republicans and Democrats, it's the US being very selective in its commitments to international law, and that is a problem, I think. I just think it goes beyond Trump potentially. Not that, again, Trump didn't take things to a whole new different level. And then with Jacob's remarks, and I share the concerns, I wonder, though, if the way that the election in 2016, in particular in the US, but I also was thinking Brexit played out, are really examples of democracy at work. Because with the huge involvement of Facebook and other actors that played a huge role in misinformation and manipulation, I wonder if it's more a matter of like, do we have democracy, functioning as opposed to, is democracy letting us down, as a way of selecting our leaders? So that's what I had so far. Sorry. Thank you.
May I take Lucretia's second comment first, if that's okay? So I think that's a brilliant comment, and I'm glad you sort of went down the more interesting road of bringing up meddling, as opposed to saying, oh, but the Electoral College, which is a fair question about the setup of the US, but a more technical, less interesting one. So I think the real challenge posed by meddling, social media, the false Brexit campaign, these are ultimately claims that the electorate lacks the cognitive competence to make decisions in the new environment, right? And that is actually, I think, an extraordinarily damning claim regarding the durability of democracy in the long term, because it's essentially saying, well, let's posit, and this could be disputed. Let's posit that liberal democracy was valid epistemically up until Trump, or up until Brexit, or up until some point shortly before then. The information environment was one that people could navigate. Suddenly, it has changed. And someone else is on the call. Uta Cole and I work on some of the technologies related to this, personalization. Something changed in the way people are provided with information that stripped them of this competence. This is a different way of suggesting that liberal democracy and self-rule of the people is no longer tenable, or no longer as tenable as it once was. So I think that this is, I think, a really complex claim, because it's sort of, I think, one problem with the narrative I just gave is it posits, this very tempting, but I think oversimplifying and perhaps just wrong narrative of it was good in the past and it's bad now, right? There was information meddling in the past, right? One thing to remember about the US, until the 1960s, you really had tremendous levels of racial voter suppression, right? So if you're going to talk about US democracy being valid, you can maybe say between 1965 with the passage of the Voting Rights Act and some point, from then on. So maybe you're only talking about this very narrow window where liberal democracy was even plausibly legitimate in the US, right? But I think the more interesting problem is that these technologies are only going to become more aggressive and more advanced, right? And the sort of big tech organizations that you've described are only gaining more and more power. They're becoming better and better at predicting human behavior. If we think they can strip the electorate of the competence to engage in self-rule, this has to be traced back to limits that persons themselves suffer or endure, right? And this requires a more complete model of at least how persons interact with these types of interfaces. I don't have any answers. I do think this is something we're going to have to face sooner or later, because it's not as though these technologies are going away, right? I think that's all I'll say for now, but though I'm happy to sort of discuss this further. And I know there was a second element to your question that was directed towards some of Jonathan's comments.
Yeah, no, thank you, Lucretia. That's a good point. This I'll put my cards on the table. I guess my basic view of global constitutionalism is largely informed by international relations. So I guess one of the advantages of interdisciplinary journal is you look at things kind of slightly differently. And so broadly, I think the global, I guess I kind of say if you can kind of imagine, if you know the IR literature well, if you could kind of imagine something like Hart and Negri meets Eikenberry, by which I mean that there's basically, yes, the US is kind of the hegemon. It essentially tries to structure the world in its own interest, and that's been largely a kind of, you know, what we call a global constitutional system. And obviously, it doesn't always lead up to the rhetoric of its ideal. So so I would press that a little bit further. If it's, you know, we can kind of think of all kinds of examples from past administrations from the end of World War II down to 2016, from, you know, some like Clintonism to kind of Obama, as kind of different kinds of interventions or failed interventions, as examples of the U.S. not necessarily living up to the principles, even like the Democratic Party, right? I think as you were kind of gesturing towards is that Trump somehow took things differently. And my read is that he's actually not really interested in the US as a global kind of hegemon anymore, right? Whereas both the Republican and Democratic Party very much were vested from World War II until 2016 in this image of the US as being the world cop, right? As in, we will invest money and weapons and blood and treasure in institutions like the UN, in things like the World Trade Organization, partly perhaps for kind of, because the US kind of claims to uphold these ideals of being a liberal democracy and thinks that's a better regime than kind of the alternatives that were out there from 1945 to 2016. And partly, quite frankly, just out of self-interest, that if the US, it's like, you know, supporting a global free trade system is very good if you're the kind of world's preeminent financial and economic power, right? And putting in place some kind of system of international law lowers the costs of you having to kind of engage in gunboat diplomacy everywhere. But obviously, where those systems don't necessarily play to the US's advantage is a very long history of the US kind of chucking those things aside. But I think there's something different, as you gestured to with Trump, where either, and I guess the bigger question is why, right? So and I don't have an easy answer for this. It's not clear to me if Trump's just this weird aberration. Like, there's one version you could just say is that, you know, if you just imagine 30 years in the future, wasn't it really weird that the US elected this kind of incompetent billionaire for 4 years and some weird stuff happened, but then things kind of largely ticked on along, right? Like if you look at like the history of the Roman Empire, there's, stories in the middle of people like Nero or whatever were just incompetent emperors, but the empire just kind of continued largely at pace. And so maybe it's just an aberration, or is it actually a moment of decline or some kind of fundamental structural change? And I think that's the kind of open question, right? And then what kind of decline is that? So again, this is the international relations part of this, right? Is that, you know, one of the big kind of grand structural things is this idea of hegemonic transition, right? Is that if one hegemonic power starts to become a little bit weaker and another one rises up, this is kind of your basic realism. There's a potential that the system that's kind of held things together for the last 70 years is beginning to fracture, and that with it we would expect would kind of lead to an unwinding of a lot of the global constitutional norms. And maybe Trump's the kind of the canary in the coal mine for that, right? What's more interesting to me is that, does that then become the Republican Party kind of ideology, right? Does this kind of isolationism, where we're no longer going to invest in these institutions, we're just going to become an isolationist power that does what we want and kind of see ourselves in rival competition with other blocs? Does that then become the norm for one political party? And then the US political process very much becomes a referendum on the international system every 4 years. And I think that is different, right? I think that's fundamentally different than a system where you have, you know, Republicans who are slightly more hawkish, Democrats who are slightly more dovish, but both kind of clearly engage in interventions, but both also kind of saw value in investing in those international institutions, right? Whereas if we go to something that's kind of more economically isolationist on trade in the Republican end of things, that's a very big realignment from a party that's basically been super pro free trade from, you know, 1945 on to today, right? And similarly, if one of the parties no longer sees any need in investing in NATO, or perhaps eventually this broaches the idea of, not leaving NATO altogether, right? Which like Trump was certainly at least signaling for a little bit. That's a very big structural change to the system. Or if the US decides to exit the UN, right? Does that become like a long-term thing for the Republican Party? Those would be the very big structural changes where then, when we talk about the global constitution, those are the institutions or the basic principles that would then lead to some kind of restructuring of the system as a whole, if you will.
So thank you very much, Jacob and Jonathan, for these points. I hope Lucretius found the answer for that question. So I saw that there was a question by one of the participants here. I'm sorry, I can't guess the name.
It was Ruth. It was Ruth.
Oh, yeah. From
Hi.
Hi, Ruth. Sorry.
So I took my hand down because my question was very similar to the idea of mis and disinformation. So I wanted to kind of see if anybody else wanted to talk about anything else before I kind of came back on and took Jacob back to mis and disinformation. But I guess I can follow what you're saying there, Jacob. So my question is probably much more naive, but I was more wanting to know then what's the role of global constitutionalism in sort of responding to or the limits of international law with respect to mis and disinformation campaigns, or specifically, let's say, disinformation campaigns. If global constitutionalism has been seen within the field of international law as filling the gaps in international law, and international law does have gaps with respect to how it can respond to this, is there a space? Is there a role? What is that role for global constitutionalism? Thank you.
So, sorry.
No.
Just to sort of add a little bit of detail to those of you who, Ruth, I'm sure you're aware this might be just more sort of the audience. A lot of the meddling occurred from foreign entities, right? So yes, you had Facebook. You had maybe domestic entities using Facebook to target voters for get out the vote campaigns more precisely. In a way, that's relatively marginal, and it's not even necessarily clear if that's bad. If you're able to sort of generate more civic engagement through algorithms, it's unclear that that's problematic. What happened that was much more sort of problematic for democratic norms is you had foreign entities, particularly foreign powers that are sort of seen as hegemonic rivals to the US, to link this to the idea of hegemony that Jonathan raised, using Facebook to try to distort the political process. And if the further, I went into this rabbit hole at one point, and it's kind of terrifying. The U.S. government has essentially created a repository of some of the Russian ads. They think that they came from Russian sort of shadow organizations funded by the Russian government. There's an enormous amount of meddling, and some of it was quite weird, right? It was trying to make sure that ranging from trying to drum up straight right-wing support, which is an interesting one. Like if you have a foreign entity simply trying to get out the vote, is that problematic? That's harder to say, to trying to get people who are more radical or will cause violence to join what might otherwise be healthy civic engagement. So at Black Lives Matter events, trying to drum up sort of trouble at those events, like really interesting. So I think there are two issues here. One of them is sort of just a rewarming of what I've already said. If foreign entities engaging in information manipulation can distort the democratic process, this again goes back to the vulnerability or the susceptibility of individuals to sort of bad information. What does this tell us about the preconditions of liberal democracy, and about maybe the idea that, behind that stripe of democracy, behind that stripe of rule by the people, there might be some necessary preconditions that we need to look at much more carefully, and that are now being tested in ways that are much more exotic. Now, Ruth, your question was specifically about the role of international law. And I think that I haven't thought about that too much. I think that's interesting. I think it's quite tricky because we think about this autonomy as fundamentally occurring within polities, right? This idea of national self-determination within within the given political unit. Foreign interference is in one respect not completely novel, and people sort of raised concerns about this around Citizens United that didn't relate to technology but related to the possibility of foreign donations. If we think that influence and access are not necessarily corrupting, does this mean a Russian billionaire can spend a ton of money on electioneering ads that are no longer regulated because the Supreme Court said even if that affects leaders because it's not a direct bribe, it can't be corrupting? So in one respect, that's not new. It points, I think, for me, the most interesting thing is it points back to that question of the competence of the electorate. I think the interesting thing about technology is it makes this meddling potentially much more diffuse, much more pervasive, and much more woven into our daily lives. And I guess going back to the international law point, I think this raises the question of, can polities be conceived of autonomously self-determining in a closed way, in a manner that I think classic liberal democracy wants to conceive of itself? Or is one of the effects of technology, particularly technology that reaches directly to persons, to create a more international community? Now, remember, I think at the beginning of the internet, I think in the 90s, I think many of us probably remember the 90s, there was this hope that what this would do was create this sort of cosmopolitan warmth, right? It would break down barriers, right? You know, the internet is going to eliminate these things that divide us. Well, maybe it won't eliminate things that divide us. Maybe it will simply make us vulnerable to new sources of power. And can international law battle those? I, right now, struggle to see how international law would be the strongest tool for handling those, as opposed to national entities taking robust, either restrictive or positive measures to ensure the competence of the electorate. It just seems to me that I can't conceive, and I'd be happy to hear if you have a view on this. I struggle to conceive how international law would have leverage into that problem of individual citizens being potentially vulnerable to bad influences, even if they come from abroad. It would have to be a national effort of resisting that. And I think it's a real question of, do you attempt to constrain the bad influence, or do you simply attempt to overwhelm it through a sense of positive civic engagement, right? A sort of positive civic Republican vision.
Thank you. So I saw that Alan had a question, but he has lowered his hand. I'm not sure if he has still a question. If so, please feel free, Alan.
Okay, well, thanks very much. I'll have a go. I don't know how well the question will come out, but I'll have a go. So one of the things I was wondering about was, you know, looking back, like the attempt to construct a constitutional treaty in the European Union, you know, in 2004-5, you know, this kind of global, this regional supranational effort at constitutionalism looked back to the American experience, you know, very self-consciously, because the American constitutional experience was one of the key founding moments of what we might call modern constitutionalism. And I just wonder really in the last few years whether or not, from a position of global constitutionalism or supranational constitutionalism, it would still be possible to look at the American example without realizing that that experience has become somewhat tainted, perhaps by the polarity, the sort of political polarizations, and also the example of Trump himself. So I just wonder whether or not the panelists might reflect on what Trump has done to the view of modern constitutionalism, looking at America as a paradigm example of that. Sorry for my daughter intervening as well, but there we are. Thanks.
That's a good, I think that's a really good question, Alan. I mean, there's a few, I kind of wonder how much of the EU vision from 15 years ago is kind of buys into the kind of took uncritically on the American myth of constitutionalism, if you will, because my first reaction is which moment of constitutionalism? So are we talking the founding, right? Or are we talking the post kind of Civil War kind of reconstruction, if you will, the reconstructed Constitution? Or are we talking the post kind of Great Depression, New Deal Constitution, right? If you at least I'm not sure, I haven't done the law side of it. Maybe Jacob can correct me, but certainly in political science, it's American constitutionalism is taught in these kind of very clear eras. And one of the things it's taught is that the constitutions was first of all, a response to a crisis. And so you can certainly tell a story of the European Union being a response to the crisis, the kind of great crisis of World War II. But that a lot of kind of these mega crises are what drove the institutions to kind of to be rebuilt in different ways, right? So I've always, I guess, and I'm not an EU expert. We've got like a reading one with Joe, so she can come in and correct me in a second. But you know, my big puzzle is will the kind of double shocks of the financial recession and now the pandemic force the EU as an institution to develop more robust institutions, or do we just simply see it starting to fracture, right? Like, what's the consequence of the other shock of Brexit on EU law? Is that then a sign that other states start to bail out? And then if that happens, I think the whole thing falls apart very quickly. Or is it a case of, well, we perhaps have to think about how the EU offers something to European citizens so they feel like they're part of something that's supranational, not just you know, a trading club and kind of you know, talking society doesn't seem to do much. I think that was my read of Brexit, is partly that very few people in the UK felt even if they voted Remain, felt like they were Europeans first and British citizens second, right? And that part of a constitutionalism it has to kind of inspire patriotism. Or if you go to the US, I think everyone's hyper nationalistic, if you will. They kind of feel their citizenship quite strongly. Even those who are critical of the US often kind of invoke the idea that this is not the US as it should be something else, right? But there's not a rejection wholesale of kind of Americanism for something else. So that to me is again a kind of another puzzle. I don't have a kind of simple answer to it, but I think that do the crises that the European Union is going through kind of lead to a strengthening of its constitutionalism? And I guess the second question is does that European constitutionalism inspire some kind of civic attachment, if you will? But I think those identities are still fairly weak, is my read.
Thank you very much, Jonathan and Jacob. So I think Joe wanted to add something. Please, Joe.
Yeah. I thought it would make most sense if I just stepped in here as well, because I mean to say something about maybe the so-called constitutional moment of the European Union that the European Constitutional Treaty might have embodied the attempt to engage in a sort of an elite-led development of a constitutional moment. That I don't think that was ever, in retrospect, destined to work at the time that it did, and how much it in any way reflected or responded to constitutional moments in the US. I think if anything, it might have responded more to the post-1989 enthusiasm for constitution building in Central and Eastern Europe, and of course around the time when the Constitutional Treaty was being discussed. In the run-up to that period, the Europe itself, the European Union, was in the process of finally, in a somewhat delayed manner, in my view, admitting new member states from Central and Eastern Europe who had been or were going through constitution building processes. And I think there might have been some cross fertilization between those ideas, but in what is in my view a somewhat deluded and misguided manner, because actually everything about the Constitutional Treaty was incredibly top-down imposed, and this is now this whole wheel is now attempting to reinvent itself with the ongoing Future of Europe conference project which has just started, which is attempts in a totally mechanistic way to involve civil society in this constitutional project, but is just in my view misconceived and misunderstands what that could do for the European Union as a non-state entity. But in a way, the constitutional treaty was perhaps a high watermark, when actually those elites that were most involved in driving that should have realized after the Treaty of Maastricht, or latest after the Treaty of Amsterdam, that the sorts of things that they somehow thought might be engendered by developing the More Europe line was just not a project that was ever likely to succeed.
Thank you very much, Joe. Any questions?
While people think of questions, I'll say briefly, Jonathan, it's interesting. I think just very briefly riffing on your question about law versus politics, I think it's quite interesting. I think there's actually a huge divide here between progressives who do see the Constitution as changing and conservatives who see it as enduring. You're most familiar with this through originalism. So some people would say the Constitution fundamentally has not changed, or has only changed the amendment process. I think one of the interesting things, and this speaks to GlobCon as a journal that works in both political science and law, is it's very easy to see the shocks that Trump and the rise of populism have caused to our political understanding of the Constitution. I think a question that your comparison with the Roman Empire was I enjoyed that. I think one of the longer questions will be how Trump potentially transforms our conception of law, right? Will legal structures endure, or do we actually look at what happened in 2020 in particular and the robustness of the structures that put Biden in office? Do we see this as actually a triumph of legal constitutionalism and the ability of those legal structures to keep the liberal project ticking along?
Thank you, Jacob, for these remarks. So, does anybody want to add any question or any point, any remark? That would be great.
I'll just make one interjection on the disinformation issue, which I was going to talk about in concluding remarks, but perhaps belongs quite well here, which is that while I appreciate all of those many complexities that were coming out, and I appreciate that tension between national and international regulation, but I think that one of the issues that we need to take into account in discussing this is the public-private divide. So speech in that context is very much both a public and a private act, in the sense that it's taking place, if on the internet, via the servers of private entities. Furthermore, I'm not sure that the extent to which academic analysis has fully caught up with not just the question of what are the accountabilities and responsibilities of private companies in respect of facilitating or facilitating free speech in this context, or making use, as Twitter did, it made use for more than a decade of Donald Trump as they wanted to act as his megaphone, but then of course there came a certain point where they said no more, you're banned from our servers. So in that case, who is Twitter responsible for? How do you frame that, given that it falls within the sphere of US law, but it's potentially more complex than that if it was also being siphoned via or through other types of other jurisdictions that were not just the American one. But the other thing that we haven't really discussed, and I've not seen anything that really addresses this, is what are the implications of the fact that this is the platform economy, if you will. It's not the same as printing a book. I don't think we should understand the role of internet communication companies or social media companies as the same as printing a book or printing a newspaper. The platform economy is something a little bit different to that, and I'm not entirely sure that we've really come to grips with what the implications of that are for any number of things, for national law, for international law, for our understandings of global constitutionalism as a set of tools to understand these questions.
Joe, I think those are both brilliant thoughts. By the way, if anyone else from who's not on the editorial board has questions, I feel like I should take
Lucretia unmuted herself, so I think she might have wanted to come in.
Yeah, but I will wait for my turn because it had more to do with something that Jacob had said before, and I didn't want to distract from your excellent points now. So, are you sure? Okay, no, because you had brought up the issue of whether the fact that Trump was voted out of office had to do with like sort of like a resilience of liberalism or liberal values, and I know nothing about American politics, but what I hear from my colleagues that know a little bit more than I do is that if the pandemic had not happened, he would absolutely have won, and he had to do much more to a reaction to his inability to make the economy get back working and just react effectively to the challenge of the pandemic than any sort of reaction to his very illiberal approach to most things, and in that sense I'm, I guess, less optimistic than you are or you wanted to be in terms of what it means that he lost, especially when he got so many votes. I would never stop being shocked about that. And I wanted to tie that with something that Jonathan had said before when he brought up the issue of hegemony, and I started thinking about that and how the US really relied on international law when it was or perceive itself, I would say more than was, as being very powerful, like the law being obviously a very important tool for hegemonic powers to build the international system to their own image, or like just to preserve their advantages to some way and in some regard. And I don't think Trump is a very enlightened leader that would have perceived this decline of power, but he has the pulse of people to some extent. He had a very strong connection with his electorate. So I wonder if this is coming more from a perception or a popular perception because of the impact of globalization and whatnot, that the US is in decline, and he was able to capture or he built on that to redefine in a way a relationship with international organizations and international law from a perceived position of weakness. Whether the US is truly in decline or not, that's the perception of his electorate. Therefore, that's what his policies would reflect, a position of weakness, which cannot take advantage, therefore, of international law, international organizations. So it, sort of shuts off or isolates itself from it to some extent. And I wonder if that makes at all any sense to Jonathan and to Jacob, because I was really hoping to hear their thoughts on that. But sorry, I distracted from the other points.
Before I turn over to Jonathan, if he has any thoughts, let me just say something very briefly. What's really interesting is I understand there's a metric that's very accurate at predicting the success of an incumbent, and it's the strength of the economy. Once the economy gets weak enough, incumbents tend to lose. This is an incredibly accurate correlate of presidential incumbent success. The coronavirus obviously trashed the economy, at least in the short term. So that's possible. And I think, and you have to remember, prior to coronavirus, the economy was quite strong. I don't think this would have been vindication of Trump's quality as a leader so much as raising these deeper questions that I can only sort of refer to of, was the electorate competent prior to the poisoning by social media, if that's what happened, right? Or is it sort of much more broadly reactive? And because Trump happened to benefit from a strong economy, maybe just incidentally, he might have been able to retain office. But that's all I'll say on that point, which is sort of a whole nother sort of question about the relation between economics and constitutionalism.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point, Lucretia. And I think the dynamic, there's a very similar dynamic amongst Brexit voters and Trump voters, right? Like we see this with the crumbling of the red wall in the UK, and with you know, the switch of kind of the upper Midwest from being solidly Democratic to being almost solidly Trump, at least Trump Republican at the moment, right? So it does seem that at least in those areas which were industrial heartlands for when the U.S. now called the Rust Belt, there's been a realignment of the voters there who see that actually this new global order hasn't worked for us, right? You can kind of tell a story from 1989 to 2016 of, you know, as the world become kind of more globalized, interconnected, the lowering of trade barriers has kind of effectively meant that most manufacturing has been shipped offshore from certainly the U.S. and the north of England to other parts of the world. Those people are definitely at least losers in the international economic game and see no benefit in being part of this kind of global structure, global constitutionalism. To them, globalization has been a net loser. So, you know, you can see that the people who kind of swooped in, the Trumps, the Farages, have kind of said, we promised something else, right? We'll go back to the past, and part of that is explicitly rejecting, you know, globalism, right? I think Steve Bannon's the one who kind of likes to label the left as globalists as opposed to nationalists, right? And that rhetoric, I think, you know, since we are a global, we did have a weird moment where one of our tweets from our account was picked up by someone on the alt-right, and they actually thought our journal was a joke. But there's this journal called Global Constitutionalism. These nerdy academics think it's a good idea, and I kind of laughed at it. And I was like, you know what? That actually to a Trump supporter, a journal called Global Constitutionalism would look pretty scary, right? This like cabal of international academics is trying to stitch up a world superstate or something. But you know, I think you're absolutely right that Trump has tapped into a sense, at least for those communities in that block of voters, that things aren't working out well for them. So the question is, can something else be offered that's not kind of right-wing populism that can, you know, get kind of buy-in back into, you know, at least things like democracy and the rule of law, right? So.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Thank you very much, Jacob and Joe, and all the questions. I think we have only 5 minutes left, so we can probably wrap up if nobody has any question or any contribution to add here. So I will leave the floor to Joe to close with her remarks. So thank you very much again for being here. I hope that we will see many of you in our next events. So please stay tuned, and please do follow our tweets and website for getting information about our summer workshop as well. So please, Joe, floor is yours. And
yeah. Well, I mean, I'm a real newcomer to global constitutionalism, although I've known Angelina, who was very much the moving force, and it's really sad that she was unable to she had other commitments that meant that she was unable to be here this afternoon. So I've known about global constitutionalism since it started, and I'm tremendously excited about the idea it might have triggered some American alt-right website to respond to our tweets. Of course, we've lost a great deal with the pandemic, but with the pandemic, we've also been able to develop other aspects of community, albeit virtual community, and that's been a lot of that's been down to the driving force of Aigen, our managing editor, who's been pushing forward with that, and thank you very much for that, Aigen. But it's good to make this connection and to use the framing of the editorial that begins the 10th year of global constitutionalism's existence, which is, you know, I think going forward in very, very good health, with a whole sort of already a great sort of a back catalogue or archive of ideas there. But there are so many things that the discussion today begs begs the question as to what next and where next in terms of global constitutionalism. I think that the whole issue of disinformation, information, management of information, the role of social media companies is begging for a global constitutionalism based analysis for the reasons I mentioned before, because I think nobody's even scratched the surface of thinking about what the implications. We thought quite a lot about what the implications of the platform economy might be for employment issues, but less so for what it means in terms of information issues. But in addition to that, there were so many aspects of the Trump experience, if you will, around toxic masculinity, around questions of policing and how state force reacts to different groups. So if you're black, or if you're from a relatively marginalized group, you may face state force in very, very different ways. And again, how are these going to be then become these elements become part of the portfolio of global constitutionalist discussion in the future? We welcome any type of different inputs in that respect. Yeah, single case studies framed within the framing of global constitutionalism, comparative work that is inspired through international relations, conceptualizations, as well as it were, comparative political studies conceptualizations. All of those fit extremely well within our very broad and capacious tent, where there still remains quite a lot of room for others to come forward. And it's 15:59, so I'll shut up. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I think we can say goodbye.
Goodbye.
Thanks to everyone for coming. This was a lot of fun. I just can't wait till we can do it in person.
Yeah, at some point. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much.